Hey there guys, this is Cole. Welcome back to another movie review. Today I'm going to be reviewing an action movie, as I'm a big fan of the genre, but I have not yet reviewed any action movies on this channel, especially old school action movies. And today's movie I'm going to be reviewing is the 1980 Chuck Norris cult classic movie, The Octagon. So, I'm a big fan of Chuck Norris, and I've enjoyed many of his movies, movies like Invasion USA, which I think is his best movie. Also movies like Missing in Action. The first two, have not yet seen the third, but I do like the first two Missing in Action movies. I also quite enjoyed the Delta Force. I think that that's a really good action movie. Silent Rage is a very underrated Chuck Norris movie. I'm even one of the few people who, I know not a lot of people like it, I'm one of the few people who likes the 1991 movie The Hitman. So yeah. And I also like the first. Now he was only in the second movie. He wasn't in the rest of them, but I do like the first two Expendables movies. But yeah, so anyways, what is the plot to and of course, movies like Lone Wolf McQuade and Code of Silence. Those are classics too. How could I forget those? But so the plot of the movie is as follows. Scott James, played by Chuck Norris, a veteran martial art expert, is recruited as the protector of the wealthy and beautiful Justine, played by Karen Carlson, after she becomes the target of a ninja clan. And sorry that I was swatting at the camera, there was a fly, but getting back to the review. When Scott finds out that his ruthless arch nemesis, McCarn, played by Lee Van Cleef, is involved with the stealthy and dangerous criminals, he is eager to settle old scores. Soon, Scott is facing off against McCarney and the entire ninja horde in an effort to take them all down. So yeah, that's the basic plot synopsis to the movie, and I overall really enjoyed this movie. So let's get into my review. So the movie starts off where we are introduced to a terrorist training camp that is basically being run by ninjas, of course, called the Octagon. And we learned that these ninjas, are basically out to get people. And not too far into the movie, early on in the movie, we're introduced to our main character, Scott James, played by Chuck Norris, who, like I said, is a martial arts expert and stuff like that. And he meets up with this girl by the name of Justine, who once again is played by Karen Carlson. And I thought the actress playing her did a good job. And so it first starts when him and Justine are basically eating dinner at a restaurant, and then Scott James, played by Chuck Norris, decides, takes her home, and I thought that the two actors had really good chemistry with each other. You definitely bought them as two friends that were dating. But then, as soon as Scott James, aka Chuck Norris, gets home, he basically tells Justine to watch out because he notices that a ninja is in the house that wants to assassinate Justine, but Scott James, played by Chuck Norris, rescues her life and stuff like that. And another aspect I really like about this movie, I think that the villain in this movie is great. I think that the villain named McCarn, who is played by Lee Van Cleef, is really good in this movie. I also do think that the action scenes are well directed in this movie too. This movie was directed by a guy by the name of Eric Carson, who after this, he would go on to direct a movie called Black Eagle from 1988, which stars Jean-Claude Van Damme, which I have not yet seen that movie, but I would like to check it out at some point because I am a fan of Jean-Claude Van Damme as an actor. And another reason I like this movie, I also like the characters. I think that the characters in this movie are likable enough, especially considering that they're played by really good actors. And there's an action scene early on in the movie I really like where there's a woman and a guy, they basically have like a baby stroller and they're walking, but then one of the bad guys pulls up with a car, but but well, one of the guys pulls up with a car by a mansion, and he gets out the car, but this woman with the supposed baby, the baby carriage, pulls out a machine gun and just pumps out rounds on the guy with a machine gun. And the practical effects are really good in the movie for the most part. And I thought that the direction by Eric Carson, the guy who directed this movie, I thought he did a rather capable job with his direction. And once again, there's also other stuff I do like about the movie too, where this is about the 42-minute mark of the movie, but a character we were introduced to earlier on in the movie, Sakura, he is at the ninja camp. However, his father is not happy with him because Sakura basically dishonors his family, and he says you are no longer to refer to this guy as your brother and stuff like that. And then not long after that, we meet up back with our main character, Scott James, played by Chuck Norris, who at about a little after the 45-minute mark, he goes up to this place because he wants to come across Sakura. That way Sakura can basically train him to be a ninja and stuff like that. But, they're not happy, but obviously we all know what happened with Sakura, so the guys tell him, sorry, I hate to tell you this, but you came up here for nothing. And then Chuck Norris, and then they're like, show us what you're made of and stuff. And then one of them says, show us what you're made of. And then Scott James, played by Chuck Norris, says, yeah, I'll do that. And then he starts beating up some guys. And then some guys say, leave. And don't ever come back here, because they're intimidated by him, which I thought was rather funny. And this is later on in the movie, but at about a little after the hour mark, AJ, who is basically a friend and a AJ, who's basically a friend of Scott James, the character played by Chuck Norris, so he's introduced earlier on in the movie, but later in the movie, Scott is told that now a woman by the name of Nancy who's one of Scott's friends, tells him that his friend and ally AJ is searching, that his friend AJ might possibly be searching for Sakura. And then, obviously, Scott James, played by Chuck Norris, is not happy about this, so he's like, what? And then, so he has to go up to this base and stuff like that. And I do really like the action scenes in the movie. I do like how, earlier on in the movie, Scott James, played by Chuck Norris, is dressed as a ninja and stuff like that, but he has to, do it to sneak around at night. I thought that was rather cool. And I do like the final showdown in this movie where the main character, Scott James, played by Chuck Norris, has to fight and take down McCarn, the villain, played by Lee Van Cleef. And they get into a really good fight, and then eventually, Scott James, played by Chuck Norris, knocks the bad guy's weapons out his hand, and they knock both the weapons out of both of their hands, and they get into a fight. And then eventually, what happens is Sakura, who was commanded to, basically kills AJ, which is Chuck Norris's or Scott James's partner, and this obviously makes him upset. So him and Sakura, they get into a fight and stuff like that, and and Justine, who was in the movie earlier, she decides to come to this terrorist training camp that's run by ninjas, and she manages to blow up one of the houses there. It causes this big explosion, and then near the end of the movie, and this movie has great lines of dialogue. I like the part where at the end of the movie, Sakura says, "This time you have broken the discipline." But then Scott James, played by Chuck Norris, says, "You don't torment me anymore, Sakura. I'm gonna kill you." And then they get into a sword fight, and then Chuck Norris or Scott James defeats the bad guy, and then the movie's over. So at the end of the day, I thought that this was a pretty good action movie. Now, would I put this in my top 5 Chuck Norris movies? Not necessarily, maybe my top 10, but at the end of the day, I did like this movie. Really, the only small little complaints I have is, again, most of the practical effects are good, but the part earlier on when one of the guys, like I said, is shot in the movie, like, the blood, like, again, I understand it was the 80s, but, like, some of it looks like paint, so it doesn't look the most convincing, and I guess my final critique with the movie is the pacing is good for the most part, but it's a little slow in the beginning. But other than that, The Octagon is a pretty good action movie from the 1980s. I recommend, especially if you're a Chuck Norris fan. And I'm going to give The Octagon an 8 out of 10. So yeah, guys, that was my review for The Octagon. And next up, I will be reviewing Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom. Yeah, we're continuing on with the Jurassic Park reviews, and then I'll do Dominion and Rebirth, and then a ranking of those movies. But until then, guys, we'll catch you later. Bye-bye.